Little green fingers. Melanie Walker has been out and about. Let's see what she's got up to this time.
Well, if it's Friday, it must be gardening, which means you got me again. And it's the third episode in our little series of how to make your garden grow and growing it for health. So we're joining Linda Galvad again in the Sarapana garden at the Saxon Hotel. And let's see what she's got this time when it comes to giving you those useful hints and tips. Linda, when it comes to gardening, you are the person I know who's got the most hints and tips and tricks on how to make things grow wonderfully. What is your favorite thing and the best thing that you've ever taught anybody about creating a productive vegetable garden?
Wow, Mel. One thing. I must say I always start with soil. Soil is definitely key. And I really try and, hit that home, because without putting your garden in a place where you're going to give your plants the best chance to succeed, you've got to give them the right kind of soil. But in terms of a lot of tips, shadow. Watch what the shadow does in your garden in summer and winter. It's really important. Trees that are deciduous sometimes offer you a space to grow in because there's a lot of sun there in winter, whereas in summer, there definitely isn't that space. So shadow is important. Watch things like buildings next door to your home. If they're 3 stories or 2 stories or a high wall, that will create a shadow. Another thing is watering. Watering is an imperative. One, to save water. As you well know, Mel, you speak a lot on water conservation. And the 2 things that I would say are primary when it comes to vegetable growing and water. If you are in a place where water is definitely a big problem, being in a semi-arid country, water is a big problem. You should grow crops that are fast growing, that fruit in a very short period of time, and also things that grow low to the ground. So instead of growing, for example, climbing beans, you grow dwarf beans, because it takes the plant a much quicker period of time to give you food. Mulching is also a very good way to preserve water, because it keeps the soil moist underneath the mulch. It doesn't allow the sun to dry it up. And lastly, watering is, I can honestly say this, put an irrigation system in. It could even, when I say that, it could even be, and this is what we often use in my own garden, I use it, a timer that works on a battery that's connected to a hose pipe with a waterer that has a 360 radius and ability. It swivels. My garden is very small, so it can have that. Putting your watering on a timer is so good for you and your garden, because a lot of people superficial water, so they'll stand in one place for 5 minutes and they'll think that there's enough water that's gone into the garden, whereas it will just be surface water and it won't be good for the plants. And of course, watering religiously at the same time is very important, because when you have watering that is not constant, it affects the plants massively and it makes them diseased, and then you're going to get disease vectors like aphids and whitefly, and that will ruin your garden for you.
I've noticed that there's a lot of flowers in this garden as well. I thought it was supposed to be a veggie garden.
Flowers are an imperative, because we need to attract as many pollinators and beneficial insects as we possibly can. So people always overlook the fact that vegetable gardens or any gardens do have pests. You'll always have pests. So I always say that variability brings stability. If you don't have pests in your garden, then there won't be food for things like ladybird larvae. And ladybird larvae, which looks nothing like a ladybird, is a ferocious consumer of aphids. If there's a pandemic in your garden, in other words, when you see a lot of a pest, that's when you have to take, external control, if I can say that. But generally, having beneficial insects like hoverfly, lacewing, ladybird, praying mantis, and then of course your pollinators like bees and butterflies, are really important to create stability in your garden, and obviously the profusion of what you see around you is because everything has its place.
This is a bit ridiculous. That's a nasturtium. Since when do they get that big in the shade?
Well, the fact that they're getting so big, the leaves look like lily pads, is already something amazing. But as I said, you know, compost is king. They're growing in the shade, they're growing in winter. The interesting thing about nasturtiums is they need a bit of a dry environment for them to flower. And you can see there are not a lot of flowers on this plant. There are some growing, you know, underneath the leaves, but they're not prolific. And it's probably because it's in the shade, so the moisture in the soil is quite high here. So the leaves are magnificent, but there aren't a lot of flowers. Whereas you'll see in the rest of the garden where it gets most of the sun, there are an abundance of flowers in it.
If you're growing a vegetable garden, people think sometimes, oh, it's just going to be all green, I'm not going to have any color in my garden. But that is actually a fallacy.
Absolutely. So I always say, you know, don't spend too much money on the structure of the garden, because the plants itself will create the palette of magnificence, if I can put it that way. That's where your aesthetics is actually going to come from. So there's so much color you can use that will grow in the garden. So for example, over here we've got a fantastic kale. Really is my favorite kale, this. It's kind of a mild kale taste. You can do so much with it. It's called a KX1. This is actually under the Linda's Original Seed range, and it is a prolific grower. It's fantastic in the winter. You know, kale does grow in the winter, and this is just, it's a wonderful, wonderful kale to have. We've got purple kohlrabi, which you'll see in a second, and that gives a leaf with a very distinct purple vein, and the vegetable itself is, you know, this magnificent purple. So we've got all kinds of colors in the garden. We've got mustard red frills, which looks like coral, and it's also purple. And then of course the different color beans, well, the bean flowers, the broad bean flowers. We've got white flowered broad beans and purple flowered or pink flowered broad beans. Obviously the different colors.
And what's that behind you? The dark purple.
That is the most fantastic plant. That is called perilla, Japanese basil. It's the purple variety. It should actually be dead in winter, but we've got some strange things happening, you know, like our borage is still alive. The nasturtiums are prolific. These things normally die when it gets really cold, especially with the frost, but we haven't had frost up till now. But winter, you've got less colors to play with, so it seems, than you do in summer. But we've got, you know, we've got the lime green color Romanesca cauliflower. We've got that deep, beautiful crimson color cauliflower, that purple cauliflower. So there's actually a lot of colors that are offered up in a winter vegetable garden.
There are a lot of cool drink bottles in this garden. I mean, I know that we go into recycling, but this is taking it to the nth degree. What are you doing here?
So these soda bottles or water bottles, we definitely don't drink the soda because it's not good for you, but we use them a fortune, as you can see. And what we use them for is to protect the seedlings when they're really tiny. In summer, we use them to protect the seedlings from birds, because that's probably its biggest threat in summer. In winter, we use the cloches to protect them from birds when they're really tiny, as well as to keep it quite warm in there and secure. Plants really, you know, they function better when they're in a secure environment. They grow better, and they grow faster. So we keep the cloches on the small seedlings. When they get to a certain height, we remove the cloches, otherwise it constricts the plant's growth. So you've got to watch that. But that is what we use the cloches for. We cut off the bottom and the top of the bottle and we secure it over the seedlings like that. It also is a protection from wind, and wind stunts plants' growth. So they are very useful. And of course we are recycling.